I was already exasperated. Why does my mother-in-law need to perform a tango at my daughter's debut party? However, when my husband saw the paper, he grinned. You should do the same. My father-in-law laughed and said, yeah, it's the same, so there shouldn't be any complaints. I was surprised. What? Is that okay? My name is Kelly, a 32-year-old housewife. I used to work at a local bookstore, and since graduating from college, I've lived surrounded by books. I'm thoughtful by nature, and it takes me a bit to get used to new environments, which is why I was single for a long time. When I was 29, a friend who was worried about my situation introduced me to a man at a literature event. He had a calm demeanor and a gentle smile. Nice to meet you, I'm Michael, he quietly introduced himself, and I was attracted to his kindness. Michael later became my husband. Our friend joined us, and we talked about many things. Michael listened kindly to my reserved way of speaking. We found we had a lot in common regarding our likes and dislikes in literature, and the conversation became very lively. Yes, that poetry collection was moving. Especially the last poem, it really touched my heart. We exchanged contact information and smoothly started dating. Michael worked in marketing at a local small business and seemed financially stable. He was always calm and respected me with a sincere attitude. I gradually began to cherish him. Michael became an irreplaceable presence in my life. A year after we started dating, he proposed to me on my birthday. Let's get married. I'll definitely make you happy. I was so happy when he said that, and I cried tears of joy. But afterward, Michael revealed something to me. Actually, I work at a small marketing company run by my father. What? I was very surprised when he said that. My father has been running a small company while contributing to the local community. It's not a big corporation, but through steady work, it has gained quite a strong reputation. He also owns various lands, so he's kind of a landlord too. I came from an ordinary family, so I was bewildered by this sudden turn of events. With such an impressive family background, is it really okay for you to marry me? I asked. My husband laughed and replied, what are you talking about? Kelly, you're my proud girlfriend and soon-to-be cherished wife. But eventually, I'll take over the company, so let's learn together about getting involved in the community. When he said that, I felt relieved. After that, we greeted both sets of parents, and everyone wholeheartedly supported our marriage. After the wedding, we decided to live with my husband's family. When we arrived with our moving boxes, his family warmly welcomed us. Once inside, my husband introduced his family. Well, you've already met at the wedding, but here's my dad, my mom, and my grandmother, the heart of the family. We're all going to be living together from now on, so please take care of my wife, Kelly. Following my husband's words, I introduced myself. I'm Kelly. It's nice to meet you all again. Hearing that, my father-in-law, who looked just like my husband, said happily, it feels like it's been a long time since the wedding, even though it wasn't that long ago. We're so happy to have a bright and wonderful woman like Kelly join our family. I replied, thank you so much for saying that, and handed the gift I brought to my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law, dressed flamboyantly, peeked into the paper bag. Oh my, what is this? I've never seen such sweets before. Before I could explain that I had chosen a local brand, she continued. These sweets look so plain. For an occasion like this, something more flashy would have been better. Like popular pastries from a department store. Well, I suppose it's fitting since you're quite plain yourself. While scrutinizing me, she said that. I was shocked by her words, but my husband quickly spoke up. Stop it, Mom. That's rude. She tried to retort, but my husband ignored her and said, Dad, Mom, Grandma, we're looking forward to living with you. My father-in-law beamed and said, we're thrilled to have both of you here. However, my mother-in-law said, this family has a proper lineage. I think we should have been more selective about who Michael married. There must be wealthier women from better families out there. Before my husband could say anything to his mother, his grandmother, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Hey, you've been noisy for a while now. Kelly is a very polite and kind person. Stop bullying her. Kelly, please take care of my son, and my mother-in-law reluctantly said. Feeling humbled, I replied, of course, stiffly. My mother-in-law had a dissatisfied look on her face and muttered, I'm not bullying. By the way, Kelly, will you continue working after getting married? My father-in-law suddenly asked. Yes. I plan to continue for now, I replied. Well, nowadays, it's important to build your career. If you ever have any problems, feel free to rely on us. Thank you. Then we moved our belongings to our house. Actually, even though we were living together, our house was separate from my in-laws. As a wedding gift, my father-in-law had built a slightly smaller house on their property for us. I was incredibly surprised when I heard about it. I had never heard of receiving a house as a wedding gift and had mentally prepared myself to live with my in-laws given their family background. Living separately but on the same property felt like a considerate proposal. Nodding at my husband, we decided to live separately on the same property. Thus, our life in the new house on the property began. It was stylishly finished to our liking, and I was excited to live there. However, on the day we moved in, my mother-in-law said, Kelly, starting today, you'll be making dinner for this house. I was very surprised to hear that. I thought we would have separate meals since we were living separately, but apparently not. You married my son, so it's only natural. Saying this, my mother-in-law returned to the main house. My husband was out at the time, so I couldn't consult him. In the end, I started cooking at my mother-in-law's house from that day on. I had practiced cooking quite a bit since deciding to marry my husband, but my mother-in-law stood by in the kitchen, commenting, "You're slow. That's not right." Despite the pressure from my mother-in-law, I managed to finish cooking and set the table. At that moment, my father-in-law and grandmother-in-law arrived, and my husband returned from being out. Huh? Why is Kelly making dinner at this house? My husband asked, looking puzzled. I honestly answered, because your mom told me to. Then, my husband's grandmother spoke to my mother-in-law. If you're going to make her do housework like this, there's no point in living separately. Isn't this supposed to be your job? My mother-in-law was at a loss for words. I had already noticed that my grandmother-in-law and mother-in-law didn't get along well. Then my father-in-law stepped in to mediate and suggested, from now on, let's have separate meals. But since Kelly cooked today, let's enjoy her meal. Oh, this is delicious. Kelly, you're really good at cooking. My father-in-law complimented my cooking. My husband also praised me, saying, I love Kelly's cooking. It's really tasty. I was happy, but my mother-in-law had a sour expression. Hearing that we would have separate meals from now on, I felt relieved. However, even after that, my mother-in-law would come to me while my husband and father-in-law were at work, giving me heavy chores and asking for help with relatives living nearby. Although she was a housewife with no job, she tried to make me do all the hard work. Being newly married, I couldn't complain and just followed her orders. One day, while I was working from home, my mother-in-law came over and said, Kelly, go buy these things now. Get the magazine and some pastries at the department store. I hurriedly replied, I'm working right now. I've told you many times that I work during the day, haven't I? But she frowned and said, What kind of work? You used to work at an office, but now you're suddenly at home. Doesn't that mean you quit? No, I switched to remote work, so I still have a job. Stop lying and just go buy it. What I say goes. Pointing at her, I said, If that's the case, isn't it natural for you to listen to your mother-in-law too? Referring to my grandmother-in-law, I tried to argue, but my mother-in-law turned red with anger and forcibly sent me shopping. I was surprised by how emotionally she reacted. Even after that, her demands never ended. She often ordered me to clean, saying she had to go to her lessons. She would push all the troublesome tasks on me and then go out. Sometimes, my husband would find out and scold her, but while she would behave for a while, she soon found another opportunity to order me around. It was clear that my mother-in-law didn't like me, but I couldn't complain to my kind father-in-law and husband, so I ended up being used by her. I endured it without causing trouble, diligently doing the housework and helping with relatives as she asked. 8 months after marrying my husband, I found out I was pregnant. My husband couldn't hide his joy and took great care of my health. When we told my in-laws about the pregnancy, my father-in-law and grandmother-in-law congratulated us, but my mother-in-law sternly asked, "Do you know the gender?" "It better be a boy." My husband immediately retorted, "That's not something Kelly can control. No matter the gender, it'll be our precious child." But my mother-in-law didn't listen and insisted it must be a boy. I tried to ignore her as much as possible during my pregnancy, but my mother-in-law continued to demand that I do housework and help neighbors. When I went to help as she asked, relatives often worried, saying, "You shouldn't overdo it since you're pregnant." When I was 6 months pregnant, my grandmother-in-law fell ill and was hospitalized. I was, of course, concerned about her, but my mother-in-law said, "You'll be taking care of her in the hospital from now on." "I'm busy with friends." I replied, "Okay," and ended up visiting the hospital frequently despite being pregnant. My grandmother-in-law often said, "I'm sorry, but I didn't mind." However, my mother-in-law's harassment continued and escalated when my grandmother-in-law wasn't around. She would sometimes order me, with my large belly, to clean and then criticize the results. She kept saying, "You better have a boy, or else." I knew I was expecting a girl, but I didn't have the courage to tell my mother-in-law. Eventually, I gave birth to a girl. We named her Emma. My father-in-law and husband were overjoyed at the hospital, saying, "She's adorable." But my mother-in-law reacted differently. "I told you it had to be a boy. You never listened to me," she complained. My husband got angry and said, "Gender doesn't matter. If you keep talking like that, you won't get to hold her." My mother-in-law sneered, "I don't need to hold such a child. I don't want to speak to this wife anymore," and left the room. My father-in-law and husband apologized to me, but I was hurt by my mother-in-law's attitude. After that, I was discharged from the hospital and started raising our daughter with my husband. My mother-in-law stopped coming to the house and rarely saw me. Thanks to that, I was able to care for my daughter peacefully. A month after Emma was born, we decided to introduce her to our relatives, renting a community center for the occasion. My father-in-law, looking apologetic, said, "We need to introduce her to the relatives, so could we borrow a bit of your time?" We nodded and agreed to attend the family gathering that Sunday. On the day, I arrived early at the venue, holding my daughter. Soon, my heavily made-up mother-in-law appeared. "What should I do?" "I've received all the food," I said, but she didn't answer and started putting up name tags. I assumed I should distribute them, so I placed the named boxes on the seats. Some female relatives helped me, but I noticed there was no box for me. "It seems there isn't one for me," I said, but my mother-in-law completely ignored me and started talking to others. I realized I was being ignored and felt my face flush. Why did I have to be ignored in front of the relatives? I had endured so much, but I couldn't take it anymore. Just then, my father-in-law and husband arrived late. Seeing my tearful face, my husband asked why. "Well, your mother ignored Kelly and didn't respond when she spoke to her. She even glared at her. It was really sad for Kelly." My father-in-law's sister answered on my behalf, having witnessed everything. Unable to hold back any longer, I told them about all the mistreatment I had received from my mother-in-law. I spoke about being forced to do housework and errands even while pregnant, the constant hurtful remarks, and being ignored and not given a meal today. Both my father-in-law and husband were shocked. Hearing one particular detail, my father-in-law's sister turned pale. "Is that true?" At that moment, my mother-in-law, oblivious to the tense atmosphere, handed me a piece of paper and left without a word. It read, "I'm going to perform a tango. Play the music when I get on stage." I was exasperated. Why does my mother-in-law need to perform a tango at my daughter's debut party? But then I remembered she insisted on playing the piano at our wedding. She likes being in the spotlight. Her flashy makeup now made sense. However, my husband saw the paper and grinned. You should do the same. My father-in-law said, laughing. Yeah, it's the same, so there shouldn't be any complaints. I was surprised. Really? Is that okay? I blurted out. Everyone there nodded, and we quickly held a strategy meeting. Eventually, all the relatives gathered, and after my father-in-law's toast, the debut party began. Everyone came to see my daughter during the meal breaks, saying, "She's adorable," and giving us gifts. My husband's relatives were kind-hearted and treated me well. They had heard from my aunt and father-in-law, and they gave me meaningful looks. I expressed my gratitude. Soon, my father-in-law took the microphone and announced it to everyone. Now, my wife will perform a tango for you. Please direct your attention to the stage. Right after the announcement, my mother-in-law appeared on stage in a bright red dress, waiting for the music to start with a composed look. But I was at the back of the venue, completely ignoring her. Of course, no music played, and she remained frozen in her pose. It was so ridiculous that I almost laughed but managed to keep it in. Eventually, she realized I wasn't going to play the music and glared at me fiercely. She then stepped off the stage and started the music herself. She returned to the center of the stage and began dancing. To say the least, she wasn't good, but she looked very pleased with herself. Come on, everyone, clap along, she said with a smile, but no one clapped. Instead, the relatives ignored the stage and continued enjoying their meals. Everyone in the venue was ignoring her. Realizing the strange situation, she stopped dancing and stood there. Hey, everyone, what's wrong? I'm dancing here, she said, but still, no one looked her way. Come on, I'll do it again. Tell everyone to clap along, she asked my father-in-law, but he ignored her too and continued offering drinks to the relatives. Then my mother-in-law finally glared at me and said, "Why didn't you play the music? I told you I was going to dance." But I ignored her and continued soothing my daughter. Why is everyone ignoring me? What's going on here? She started stomping her feet in her bright red, frilly dress. That didn't suit her at all, with makeup that was way too heavy. Her appearance was quite embarrassing. At that point, my husband stood up and said, exasperated, "Do you want to know why? It's because you ignored Kelly in the first place." My mother-in-law looked shocked. What? So, everyone is ignoring me because I ignored her? Cold stares from the relatives were now directed at her. That's ridiculous. Retaliating because I ignored her? How childish, she said. Then my father-in-law spoke up. Who's being childish here? You didn't even prepare a meal for Kelly, did you? Do you think that's acceptable? His anger seemed to panic her, and she started yelling with a red face. What? What? I never liked this plain wife from the start. And I told her to have a boy, but she had a girl instead. She continued, oblivious to the relatives' shock. This family is proud and respectable. And yet, she comes from an ordinary family and gets a house built for her. And she lives there so brazenly. It makes me furious. And she gave birth to a girl. She never listens to me. Ignoring such a worthless wife is only natural. Breathing heavily, she glared at me with anger. Then my husband said firmly, "So that's why you've been tormenting Kelly?" My mother-in-law raised her voice. I wasn't tormenting her. She's just exaggerating. Everyone, you're being fooled by this wife. She's trying to set me up. But then voices from the relatives rose. Even when she was heavily pregnant, she always came to help us. I visited their house and saw her cleaning the second-floor windows. Testimonies of my mistreatment poured in from the relatives, and my mother-in-law's face turned paler and paler. Clearing his throat, my father-in-law spoke again. Kelly has been enduring silently, not wanting to worry me or our son. I'm heartbroken that we've put her through this. What have you done? Relatives looked at me with sympathetic eyes, and I nodded with a pained expression. What? Why is everyone taking this wife's side? I'm the one in charge here. A wife who doesn't listen to her mother-in-law deserves to be thrown out. My mother-in-law's true colors were fully revealed. Then, a calm voice addressed my mother-in-law, who was flustered on stage. Do you think a mother-in-law can just throw out a daughter-in-law? It was my grandmother-in-law, being wheeled in by my aunt. She was undeniably the most authoritative figure present. Aren't you supposed to be in the hospital? What are you doing here? My mother-in-law asked in a panic. I got temporary permission to come because I heard it was my great-grandchild's debut party. Besides, that outfit is neither age-appropriate nor decent. You look like a clown. Relatives burst into laughter, and chuckles could be heard around the room. My mother-in-law's face turned red as she bit her lip. You always said you were busy with lessons, and it turns out you were learning tango. You're the one who doesn't listen. I told you many times not to be so hard on Kelly. My grandmother-in-law said, making my mother-in-law bow her head in silence. Kelly is a wonderful daughter-in-law. She's kind, straightforward, and always treated me well. She's nothing like you. My grandmother-in-law sighed. And on top of tormenting her, you've done something even worse. My mother-in-law tilted her head in confusion. Worse? I don't understand. What do you mean? She asked, perplexed, and my aunt stepped forward. You told me that Mom's hospital bills were high and asked me to give you $2,000 a month, didn't you? My mother-in-law's face tightened instantly. Another relative chimed in, same here, I've been giving $1,000. I asked Kelly about it. She said Mom's hospital bill is about $700 a month, and my brother pays the entire amount. Yes, I had been handling the payments at the hospital. I received the money from my father-in-law, and it was never that expensive. But I had seen my mother-in-law getting money for the hospital bills from other relatives. My aunt's expression changed because I had told her about this. After that, she spread the truth to the relatives and instructed them to ignore my mother-in-law. That was the background to her lonely tango earlier. My mother-in-law was questioned about the tens of thousands of dollars collected from the relatives. What did you do with that money? They demanded. Under the intense glares from everyone, she stammered. I spoke up. I've noticed you've been carrying expensive brand-name bags and wearing pricey clothes to your lessons recently. Together, those must be worth over $20,000. How did you buy them? My mother-in-law shouted, mind your own business, but the relatives' criticism continued. Seeing her isolated, my grandmother-in-law said firmly, a wife should listen to her mother-in-law, right? I want you out, but what does my son think? She asked my father-in-law. He looked directly at my mother-in-law and said, you don't do any housework, just focus on your lessons. You bully Kelly and extort money from the relatives for your luxury. I can't live with you anymore. We're getting a divorce. Leave. My mother-in-law turned pale. Divorce? No way. Why do I have to leave? She screamed. My husband joined in, of course, we're cutting ties with you too. We won't have any contact with you from now on. My mother-in-law cried out, don't say that, but the relatives were already glaring at her coldly. They also declared they were cutting ties with her. I looked at my mother-in-law, who had collapsed to the floor, and said, well then, our relationship ends here. Goodbye. We won't be seeing each other again. After that, she was escorted out of the venue by the relatives, still in her bright red dress. Thank you, Michael. No, I'm really sorry for not noticing until now. From now on, please feel free to talk to me about anything. My father-in-law, looking tired, said with a smile. My relationship with her has been rocky for a long time. I knew it would come to this eventually. Don't worry about it. Please take care of my son and granddaughter, Kelly. My grandmother-in-law approached and gently hugged me and my daughter. Kelly, think about your happiness from now on. I'm sorry for all the terrible things my daughter-in-law did to you. I teared up and showed my gratitude to my family and relatives. Later, I heard that my mother-in-law clung to my father-in-law at home, begging not to divorce her, but he didn't change his mind. Eventually, the divorce negotiations were handled through lawyers. During this time, my mother-in-law called me and pleaded. "If you say you forgive me, everything will go back to normal. Please, just say it." But I ignored her and blocked her number. She was demanded to repay the money she had collected from the relatives, and she sold all her brand name items to gather funds. Even then, she had to take on debt to cover the shortfall. After that, she was kicked out of the house by my father-in-law. He gave her a fair share of the assets, which might have been his final act of kindness. Having nowhere to go, she tried to return to her rural hometown, but her father, having heard everything from my aunt and father-in-law, was furious and cut ties with her. She was turned away at the door. In the end, she ended up in a rundown house that seemed ready to collapse. Having never worked before, she started a part-time job to pay off her debts, but her personality caused her to not last long at any workplace. A letter pleading for help arrived for my husband, but he threw it straight into the trash. Once living a life of luxury, my mother-in-law had fallen from grace. She would likely continue to live in poverty and isolation. I felt no sympathy for her. Meanwhile, I continued my new life with my husband, working together to raise our daughter. My grandmother-in-law had safely been discharged from the hospital and was living peacefully in the main house with my father-in-law. I offered to help with the housework, but my father-in-law declined and hired a housekeeper instead. Thanks to this, we often received shared meals and enjoyed delicious food every day. "Well, it doesn't quite match Kelly's cooking," my father-in-law said with a smile. Since then, my aunt and other relatives have treated me warmly. I voluntarily help with their work and value my relationships with them. My grandmother-in-law dotes on my daughter, and I hope she lives a long life. By the way, I am currently expecting our second child, a boy. My husband, father-in-law, grandmother-in-law, and daughter are all overjoyed and eagerly await the arrival of the new family member. I plan to cherish my family, live a happy life with them, and create many wonderful memories together.